Writing just 2 days ago, Ted Gioia describes the American experience not as a fixed heritage, but as a restless, freestyle saxophone solo. There is a specific kind of freedom in that lack of tradition, the ability to invent a self from scratch. It creates a striking tension with a piece from early June, where Neera Chandhoke examines philosopher K.C. Bhattacharya's call for swaraj in ideas. While one writer celebrates the blank slate of the New World, the other details the grueling work of clearing away the mental habits left by colonial rule. It's worth pausing on whether the improvisational spirit of jazz is actually a requirement for achieving true intellectual independence. Ted Gioia compares his childhood in Hawthorne to a sax solo in a piece published just 2 days ago for The Honest Broker. Notice how he uses that image to evoke a town where a shoe store owner and a real estate developer share the same history. Listen for the friction that develops when he leaves his hometown for the rigid social hierarchies of Oxford.
What is my American identity, really? And who gets to decide it? I am an American, born in SoCal, where I learned to go at things as I taught myself, jazzy and freestyle. It helped that Los Angeles, during my childhood, existed without any burden of tradition. I could make things up as I went along, almost as if my life were a sax solo. There wasn't much money in my hometown of Hawthorne, California, but totally absent was old money. There were no established families or fancy neighborhoods, although my mom joked about some imaginary divide. When I told her that Norman Mailer wrote about Marilyn Monroe's impoverished childhood in Hawthorne, she griped, "Marilyn grew up on the good side of town." Everything existed in a jumble at the intersection of working class and middle class. My family, like many others, moved back and forth over that divide. My father worked as a servant almost until age 40, then put aside enough money to open up his own shoe store. By Hawthorne standards, this was a big deal. The richest guy from Hawthorne back then was a real estate developer named Ernest Hahn, one of the inventors of the shopping mall. Hahn had been a poor immigrant son, just like my dad. I got to meet him once. He was friendly and remembered everybody's name, and their spouses and children's names too. One of Hahn's first construction projects was a simple job for my grandfather, who ran a liquor store in Hawthorne at the time, and needed some work done on the shop. That was a tiny project, but when Hahn died in 1992, the LA Times called him one of America's wealthiest men. Of course, Hahn had moved out of Hawthorne long before. That made perfect sense. My hometown was no place for the super rich. But I flourished in that working class environment.
I believed that my hometown represented America at its best, without much baggage. When I got a scholarship to Oxford some years later, I was shocked by the intense British class consciousness and its latent hostilities. I felt awkward seeing the college servants, especially the college scout assigned the job of cleaning my room. A Sisyphean task, that. I was reminded of my father's years working as a chauffeur for a rich man. How had I stumbled from one side of the divide to the other? The United States isn't really a society without economic classes, but it looks that way from the perspective of Oxford. Christopher Hitchens summed up the British attitude in an anecdote. An old joke has an Oxford professor meeting an American former graduate student and asking him what he's working on these days. My thesis is on the survival of the class system in the United States. Oh, really? That's interesting. One didn't think there was a class system in the United States. Nobody does. That's how it survives. I now realize that going overseas was the fastest way for me to understand what it meant to be an American. It's perhaps amusing, or tragic, that the people I've met in other countries often have a clearer image of Yankees than I do myself. I've always had confusing notions about my identity. My father was Sicilian and my mother Mexican. And there are also Native American and Swedish strands in my convoluted DNA. So what am I exactly? What is my American identity? I look white enough, and that's how others view me. But I've never really been certain about that. To this day, I hate filling out forms that ask for my ethnic identity. It's even stranger for my children, because my wife's father is from India, and her mother's family came from Ireland.
So, we are a confusing breed in my household, straddling at least 6 different ethnic groups from 3 continents. But there's at least consolation in the fact that we can celebrate almost every holiday, from St. Patrick's Day to Cinco de Mayo, with some authenticity. Please support my work by taking out a premium subscription for just $6 per month, even less if you sign up for a year. By the way, I think this ambiguity is why my Sicilian relatives have such close relationships with Jews. Yes, that's true in real life, and not just mafia movies. When I tell most people that I'm unsure whether Sicilians really classify as white, they look at me like I'm crazy. But my Jewish friends understand. We both straddle that uncertain territory between insider and outsider. Keep reading with a 7-day free trial. Subscribe to The Honest Broker to keep reading this post and get 7 days of free access to the full post archives.
Ted Gioia presents a version of American life that feels like a clean break from history. In Hawthorne, the lack of old money or established families isn't a void, it's the stage for a saxophone solo. Identity is built in real time, defined by what a person does rather than where they come from. It's a freedom that only becomes visible once it's contrasted with the latent hostilities and college scouts of the British class system. What jumps out reading Neera Chandoke is how that same sense of a blank slate starts to look different. Writing about the philosopher K.C. Bhattacharya, Chandoke describes a cultural subjection that arrives through the subtle replacement of one's own ideas with those of a dominant power. Where Gioia finds liberation in the absence of tradition, Bhattacharya warns of a slavery of the spirit that happens when an alien culture possesses a person like a ghost. It's a striking friction. Gioia's improvisational identity depends on the good side of town being an imaginary divide, while Chandoke explores the landmines of a culture trying to reclaim its own mind after 160 years of colonial rule. One writer sees the lack of baggage as the ultimate gift. The other suggests that without a traditional cast of ideas to fight for, the mind might not be as free as it feels.
Any discussion of Indian culture, per se, is strewn with landmines. Let me expand on these difficulties with reference to a major debate that continues to stalk discussions on culture. Some of these difficulties were pointed out by two philosophers, Dharmendra Goyal and Rajendra Prasad, in their comments on Swaraj in Ideas, authored by the eminent philosopher Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, 1875 to 1949, or KCB as he is popularly known. We begin then with KCB's argument. In 1929, KCB, George V Chair at Calcutta University, delivered the Sir Ashutosh Memorial Lecture to students at Hooghly Mohsin College in Chandernagore, located at a short distance from Calcutta. The essay was found in his papers after his death and published. The publication of Swaraj in Ideas was well received by the philosophical community, and most tomes on Indian political philosophy include profound commentaries on his intensely reflective talk. The lecture was delivered in the context of momentous political changes in the country, the swell of nationalism under the inspired leadership of Gandhi, the adoption in 1929 of the resolution on Purna Swaraj by the Indian National Congress, and the spiritualization of the discourse on freedom by public intellectuals. Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya gave the concept of freedom a new dimension by focusing specifically on intellectual liberation from another culture. The issue that he raised was this: how do ideas and ideals introduced by a dominant culture to a colonized culture affect the freedom to think, reflect, and evaluate? How do we acquire Swaraj in ideas in an intellectually dominated society? The task is difficult, he admitted, because though it is easy to understand and even resist political domination, intellectual hegemony is so subtle that it escapes comprehension and sure grasp. When he spoke of cultural subjection, he did not mean the assimilation of an alien culture. That assimilation need not be an evil. It may be positively necessary for healthy progress, and in any case, it did not necessarily imply a loss of freedom. There is cultural subjection only when one's traditional cast of ideas and sentiments is superseded without comparison or competition by a new cast representing an alien culture, which possesses one like a ghost. This subjection led to slavery of the spirit. When a person can shake himself free from it, he feels as though the scales have fallen from his eyes. He experiences a rebirth, and that is what I call Swaraj in Ideas, wrote KCB. KCB was not a nativist who disdained other cultures, nor was he naive. A country that had been ruled by the British for more than 160 years by the time he gave his lecture could hardly escape the impact of Western systems of learning and interpretation. Indeed, this is the nature of colonialism everywhere. It leaves indelible imprints, not only on the economy, society, and politics, but majorly on systems of knowledge. The colonized begin to look at their own past and intellectual inheritance through cognitive resources bequeathed by the colonizer. The colonizer is ingenious. He controls the mind of the colonized through hegemony, a term popularized by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Their capacity to think reflectively or creatively or independently is consequently mediated by another culture. As KCB suggested, it is not as if a foreign culture had been imposed upon us forcibly.
We ourselves asked for this education, and this had been a blessing. The problem came from the thoughtless and unthinking acceptance and even absorption of ideas and ideals that had their source in another culture. Proceeding to elaborate on what he called the slavery that had entered our very soul, KCB suggests true knowledge comes not from knowledge of ideas and ideals from another culture, but by assimilating them in an aware and open-eyed way. The Indian mind failed to do this. It had subsided below the conscious level of knowledge. Partly or incompletely assimilated ideas from the West had induced in us a shadow mind that functions like a real mind, except in the matter of genuine creativeness. Interestingly, G.K. Chesterton, in the Illustrated London News of September 18, 1909, had used the phrase shadow mind. He had written that Indian nationalism was neither Indian nor nationalist. Indians who demanded home rule belonged to an elite that did not represent Indian opinion. They were a small and decultured group that existed in a false shadow world. Their intellectual world was shadowed because they had been somewhat educated by British education and civilization, yet they were still partly darkened by India's obscure Oriental traditions. KCB did not use the phrase shadow mind in quite the same dismissive way. The shadow mind is the unhappy product of ready and unexamined acceptance of ideas and ideals from other cultures. Resultantly, a layer of Western knowledge coexists, somewhat uneasily, with layers of our own knowledge. Our minds are a pastiche of Indian and Western ideas. This results in a lack of clarity and leads us towards confusion. If we take ideas from others without understanding whether they are relevant for us, and if we do not know how to reconcile them with our own cultural meaning systems, the process does not result in a creative mind, but a mind that jostles between different sorts of ideas and ideals. It is not the acceptance of, but the uncritical acceptance of Western ideas that troubled KCB. For the process generates neither creativity nor renewed imaginations. For KCB, the Indian mind had lapsed. Slavery has entered into our very soul. One would have expected, wrote KCB, that after a century of contact with the vivifying ideas of the West, there should be a vigorous output of Indian contribution in a distinctive Indian style to the culture and thought of the modern world. Contributions specially to the humane subjects like history, philosophy, or literature, a contribution such as may be enjoyed by our countrymen who still happen to retain their vernacular mind, and which may be recognized by others as reflecting the distinctive soul of India. But Indian literary figures had not been able to offer analyses or assessments of Western literature from the Indian point of view. In their writing, they tended to resemble Western critics. Therefore, we did not know whether it was our judgment, forged on the anvil of Indian literature and aesthetics, or whether it is not merely the mechanical thinking of the galvanic mind induced in us through our Western education. There was nothing to show that we had achieved a synthesis of Indian with Western thought, especially in the field of philosophy. And it was in philosophy that the task of discovering the soul of India was imperative for the modern Indian. Genius can unveil the soul of India in art, but it is in philosophy that we can methodically attempt to discover it. KCB foregrounded issues that require deep thought. How can we live a life of the mind, he asked, when we are trapped in a welter of unsynthesized ideas? What troubled KCB was the consequence of this non-assimilation, the apathy of and the growing lack of vigor in Indian philosophy. The Indian mind neither welcomes nor resists the ideas through the new education. It dares not exert itself in the cultural sphere. Accordingly, we had failed to develop a distinctive intellectual identity. We could not tell who we were because we lacked a grounded understanding of our own cultural and historical situation. Soulless thinking appeared to be real thinking, but it was not. The only way out was to conceptualize an Indian way of responding to new texts and abjuring the tendency to repeat what came to us from the West. The issues articulated by KCB form an integral part of a debate that continues to trouble the mind of philosophers. How can we think clearly when the cultural context within which we think is marked by a muddled and somewhat chaotic juxtaposition of cultural meanings from abroad? Some years before KCB, Sri Aurobindo had published a series of essays in the monthly review, Arya, on the Renaissance in India, 1918, Indian Culture and External Influence, 1919, Is India Civilized, 1918-19, and A Defense of Indian Culture, 1919. These were republished in 1920 and then in 1997. In this work, he tackled the same issue as KCB did in 1929. When two cultures encounter each other, a certain amount of imitation, or even a great amount, is a psychological necessity of the situation.
When a culture that has fallen into a state of inactivity receives the shock of a waking, active, tremendously creative civilization, when it finds thrown upon it novel and successful powers and functionings, it is impelled by the very instinct of life to take over these ideas and forms, to annex, to enrich itself, even to imitate and reproduce, and in one way or another take large account and advantage of these new forces and opportunities. But if there is only a mechanical imitation, if there is a subordination and servitude, the inactive or weaker culture perishes. It is swallowed up by the invading Leviathan. We must accept, wrote Aurobindo, that some imitation of the more powerful culture is inevitable. We cannot reject it because interaction with the environment is essential for healthy persistence and growth. The living organism that rejects all such interchange will speedily languish and die of lethargy and inaction. We had taken over in literature the form of the novel, the short story, the critical essay, methods of science. In politics, the press, the platform, the forms and habits of agitation, and the public association. No one wanted to get rid of these additions, he said. The question was, what do we do with them? Could we transform them into instruments and molds of our own spirit? If so, there has been acceptance and assimilation. If not, there has been merely helpless imitation. We had to integrate them into our characteristic way of being and transform them by enabling these ideas to shape action. But if we take over anything, the good and the bad in it will come together pell-mell. We had to therefore learn to discriminate between the good and the bad.
Whatever helps me, argued Aurobindo, to find myself more intimately, nobly, and with greater and sounder possibility of self-expressive creation is good. Whatever carries me out of my orientation, whatever weakens and belittles my power, richness, breadth, and height of well-being, is bad for me. If I accept ideas, liberty, equality, democracy, it is not because they are European, but because they are human, and because they are of greatest importance to the life of man. What I mean by assimilation is that we must not take it crudely in the European forms, but must go back to whatever corresponds to it, illumines its sense, justifies its highest purport in our own spiritual conception of life and existence, and in that light work out its extent, degree, form, relation to other ideas, application. I take it as a self-evident law, continued Aurobindo, of individual being applicable to group individuality, that it is neither desirable nor possible to exclude everything that comes into us from outside. I take it as an equally self-evident law that a living organism, which grows not by accretion, but by self-development and assimilation, must recast the things it takes in to suit the law and form and characteristic action of its biological or psychological body, reject what would be deleterious or poisonous to it,
And what is that but the non-assimilable? And take only what can be turned into useful stuff of self-expression. The answer to the question of how we should assimilate a more powerful European culture was that we must evaluate and absorb what was relevant to us. In effect, for Aurobindo, what we receive from another culture comes as a mixed inheritance, in which the good and the bad are inextricably intertwined.
What we can do, however, is to judge what is genuinely good for human beings and to reject every idea that is poisonous. Aurobindo suggested, in sum, that we should evaluate whether the ideas we accept are relevant for our times, our needs, and our aspirations. He therefore gives the receiving and the less powerful culture the capacity to choose between ideas that flow like a torrent from the West. The implication is that we can liberate ourselves from the tyranny of all received ideas and ideals when we can figure out which ideas enrich our mind and which constrain it. This is how freedom of the intellect can be secured. Excerpted with permission from Languages of Freedom, The Idea of India in Political Theory, Bombay Cinema, and Progressive Urdu Poetry. Neera Chandok, Speaking Tiger Books.
A saxophone solo doesn't come with a map, and neither does a mind trying to unlearn the habits of a colonial education. There's a heavy quiet that follows the rejection of old money traditions or borrowed philosophies. Whether it's Gioa finding a rhythm without European history, or Bhattacharya demanding a break from inherited thoughts, the difficulty remains: how to build a self from scratch. What lingers is the vulnerability of an unscripted life. If the old structures are truly gone, what keeps the song from turning into noise?